In this episode, we diagnose the engine overheating issue that we had while touring Penobscot Bay, check out a number of potential culprits, and work towards a solution. If you watched our last episode, you'll remember that we had an engine overheating problem coming out of Castine, the farthest point of our trip. Before leaving docks, moorings, or anchorages, I checked the oil, coolant level, and transmission fluid to make sure everything is in order and reduce the chance that we have problems out on the water. I also checked the amount of water coming out of the engine exhaust. All looked good, so I was a bit perplexed when the engine quickly started overheating about an hour into our trip from Castine. After shutting the engine down, I rechecked the oil and coolant, and everything was as I found it before leaving the dock. The water flow through the exhaust was also strong, but I still checked the sea strainer and impeller to make sure that everything was in good shape and no debris was blocking things. When we returned to our home dock, I started to look further into what could be the problem. I noticed that there was a good deal of fluid under the engine in the separate engine bilge. I took a plastic cup and started to empty the bilge into 1-gallon containers. The fluid was yellow and it looked and smelled like antifreeze. I filled 1-gallon container and about a third of another, about the entire coolant capacity of the engine according to the manual. The coolant overflow tank was still filled with the same yellow fluid at the normal appropriate level. Very strange. I opened the coolant fill cap on the engine and didn't see any fluid. Oh, this isn't good. The hose from the coolant overflow tank was blocked and was not exchanging fluid like it should. So the next question is whether the lack of coolant was caused by a pre-existing leak, or worse, due to a cracked engine block afterwards. To determine that, I needed to put coolant back in the system and see whether I could see any coolant leaking from around the engine block. Between the trip from Vermont and Penobscot Bay trip, I had put about 120 hours on the engine since I purchased the boat, and the engine was starting to look pretty dirty. It was a good time to clean the engine, so I would have the best chance of detecting any leaks from the engine. After making sure I had the necessary materials, which I list in the video description, I covered the areas of the engine that should not get wet, like the air intake, alternator, and electrical wiring, and placed a cloth diaper under the engine. I dipped a paintbrush into a diluted Dawn dishwashing liquid solution and started painting the engine, agitating grimy areas with a brush. The soap worked well and I lightly washed it off and then dried the engine with shop towels. There was some rust on the engine, but I didn't tackle that at this time. I just wanted to make sure I could detect any leaking from the engine block. At least the engine looked much better. I emptied the remaining coolant out of the engine, there wasn't much left, and then refilled the engine with distilled water, ran the engine for 10 to 15 minutes, drained the water, and refilled with new coolant. The engine was no longer overheating. I also replaced the hose between the coolant overflow reservoir and the cap on the engine and confirmed that the fluid was now flowing between them. Well, at least that now works. Now that I was sure the engine was no longer overheating, double-checking with an infrared thermometer, I crossed my fingers and started probing around the engine with a flashlight, fearful for what I might find. The good news was that I did not see anything leaking from the engine block itself. I also did not see any leaking from any of the hoses. I did, however, see coolant leaking from the heat exchanger, with a drip occurring about every 30 seconds or so. The heat exchanger was also showing signs of corrosion around where it was leaking. I had found the cause. The leaking heat exchanger was 2 inches in diameter. Consulting the internet again, I found that many folks with the Universal M25XP engine had replaced the 2-inch exchanger with a 3-inch version. In fact, I found reports that Ericsson, the manufacturer of my boat, started using 3-inch heat exchangers after 1987, the year my boat was built. Those that installed the 3-inch exchanger seemed very happy. Folks seemed to have good success with Mr. Cool, so I found the part number for the right 3-inch exchanger and ordered it, about $425. The new exchanger also used a 5/8-inch intake hose instead of a 1/2 hose used for the 2-inch exchanger, so I ordered one of those as well. Fortunately, the hose connector on the diesel was designed to work with either 5/8-inch or 1/2-inch hoses. When the heat exchanger and hoses arrived, I emptied the coolant again and performed a bit of boat yoga to remove the old heat exchanger and install the new one. With the new heat exchanger strapped in, installed, and clamped, I filled the engine with coolant again, fired it up, and ran it for a while at elevated RPMs. The new exchanger seemed to be working really well, so well in fact that the temperature gauge barely started to register after running the engine for 10 to 15 minutes. I used an infrared thermometer to measure the temperature on the engine, and it was definitely running cooler than before. The new heat exchanger seemed to definitely be an improvement. Since then, I've run the engine many times for long periods of time. The temperature rises to 160 degrees and then stops, as opposed to before when it usually rose to 180 degrees. Now, whenever I check the coolant, I always open the coolant cap on the engine and don't trust the level in the overflow reservoir. If you like what you see, please hit the subscribe button. And if you'd like to be notified when the next video comes out, please hit the bell button. And if you have any comments about the journey, we'd love to hear from you. Thanks a lot!